Hello, and welcome to your lecture on the Minoans and the Mycenaeans. Grab your student notes and use them to follow along and fill in any blanks that you missed in class. Future ages will wonder at us, as the present age wonders now, proclaimed Pericles, an Athenian statesman, and he was right. Today, as members of that future age, let us take a moment to wonder at the ancient Greeks, whose ideas and creativity still influence us to this day. Greece is a mountainous country near the Mediterranean Sea that has the third longest coastline in Europe and many islands. Ancient Greece, of course, was not one country, but rather a collection of city-states, where each city, Sparta, Athens, Thebes, was basically its own country. Where have you seen city-states before? If you answered Sumer, you are absolutely correct. So you remember cities like Uruk and Kish were their own entities until they're all united under Sargon the Great. The Greek city-states had different cultures, but similar language and religion. You can think of them as like siblings in one big family, each with their own personality. And like siblings, sometimes they got along. They traded with each other, they helped each other out. Sometimes they didn't, and they went to war instead. Greek language, culture, art, architecture, ideas, and inventions still influence us to that day. That is a long list, far too long for me to go into detail right now. So let me give you one example of how the ancient Greeks still influence us today. It's an example for architecture, the way that you build buildings. Take a look at these stunning ruins of a Greek temple, the tall, stately columns. These are Corinthian columns. You can tell by the designs at the top. Now, see how the Greeks influenced us. Here is the Supreme Court of the United States of America. Look familiar? It's basically a Greek temple. Long before there were beautiful temples with Corinthian columns, however, you have the very earliest Greeks, the Minoans. The Minoans were Bronze Age sailors and traders who lived on the island of Crete. Crete was located between rich empires. You have the Hittite Empire, the Egyptian Empire, and the Mycenaean civilization. It was only natural that these powers would want to trade, and the Minoans were all too happy to trade with them. It wasn't too long before they became filthy rich. Although we call this ancient civilization Minoan, they probably wouldn't have called themselves that. The name Minoan actually comes from mythology. According to Greek myth, there was a king named Minos who ruled Crete, and he decided to build a labyrinth to house his stepson, the Minotaur. The Minotaur was a ferocious monster with the body of a man, the head of a bull, and an unfortunate taste for human flesh. He dined yearly upon the youths and maidens of Athens, until at last the Greek hero Theseus came to the labyrinth and slew him. The fame of the Minotaur and of his stepfather, King Minos, did not die with them. The mythical King Minos ended up giving his name to the actual civilization, and they became known as Minoans. As for the Minotaur, his labyrinthine prison has been the subject of many an archaeological search. There is evidence that there may have been some sort of labyrinth. An enormous palace was found at Knossos, and labyrinthine cave systems have been found. As with many myths, this one may have a grain of truth in it. Of course, you know what would make it really easy to know if there actually was a labyrinth, or a King Minos, or kings at all in Minoan society? If they wrote it down. After all, writing is the most important technology for storing information and passing it along, right? Luckily for us, the Minoans did write. Unluckily for us, we can't read it. Minoan script is known as Linear A. Here's an example of Linear A, the Minoan writing system. It's called linear because it's written in a horizontal line. It's called A because it's the earliest writing we have from Crete. Historians are very creative with their naming. Since no one has figured out how to read Linear A, our only clues to Minoan society come from their buildings, their items, and their pictures. We can look at Minoan buildings, such as the palace at Knossos, and tell what kind of materials they used, how they built their buildings, what they might have stored. We can look at items like this Minoan vase. What kind of stuff did Minoans keep? What kind of pictures did they paint on them? What might they have used them for? But some of our very best insights into daily life in ancient Crete come from frescoes. Frescoes are paintings done on the wet plaster of a wall or ceiling, so that when that wall or ceiling dries, the painting becomes a part of it. This fresco is called the ship fresco, and it has the earliest recorded town scene. You can see the buildings here and the ships in the water. This could be a record of merchants' overseas contacts. It also provides us great insight into what their boats look like, their buildings look like, what kind of animals lived nearby. Bull leaping frescoes, which show people somersaulting over bulls, provide a very different insight into Minoan society. Was this a sport? A form of worship? Either way, it provides an interesting tie-in to the myth of the Minotaur, don't you think? Minoan civilization may have lasted as long as 1,200 years, but it couldn't last forever. Enter the Mycenaeans, a new power in the Mediterranean. The Mycenaeans conquered Crete in the 15th century BC, taking it from the Minoans. They must have believed in the power of a good defense, because the Mycenaeans built walls so tall and strong that future Greeks thought that normal humans couldn't have built them. Instead, they thought the Cyclopes, giants with only one eye, must have built these walls, and they're known even today as Cyclopean walls. Like the Minoans before them, the Mycenaeans became a major power in the Mediterranean Sea, controlling trade between the various other powers. Unlike the Minoans, however, they didn't just live on Crete. The Mycenaeans lived on the mainland of Greece as well. Their name comes from the city of Mycenae, which was the city of King Agamemnon in Homer's famous work, the Iliad. The Iliad, of course, which you're reading in the form of Black Ships Before Troy, is the story of the Greeks trying to get Helen back from the Trojans, their 10-year-long siege at Troy, and their eventual victory. In other words, the Greeks who fought at Troy and built that famous horse would have been Mycenaeans. Now, when the Mycenaeans invaded Crete and took it over from the Minoans in the 15th century BC, they didn't have their own writing system. But they liked the idea of writing. They thought the Minoans had a great idea, and so they decided to use the Minoan writing system to write their own language. We call this Linear B. And the exciting thing about Linear B is that when the code was finally cracked, it was discovered that this is the earliest form of the Greek language in existence. The Mycenaeans were speaking this really early form of Greek 500 years before Homer wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey. The Bronze Age was an exciting time period to live. You had the agricultural revolution, turning people away from hunting and gathering and toward farming. You have the slow improvement of lifestyle, an explosion of new inventions, the wheel and the loom and writing. You have the growth of civilization. But then, around 1200 BC, it all comes tumbling down. And next week, we're going to talk about just that when we discuss the Bronze Age collapse. See you next week.